In the year 1118, one of the most mysterious and powerful organizations in human history was born. A group of just 9 knights founded a military order that, over the centuries, would become synonymous with legend, secrecy, and conspiracy. Initially tasked with protecting Christian pilgrims, these men quickly transformed into bankers, strategists, architects, and royal advisors. They built fortresses across Europe and mastered the arts of warfare, faith, and silence. They amassed so much power that they became a genuine threat to the very church that had created them. And for that, they were hunted down, tortured, and eliminated. But did they really vanish? Or did they simply change their name and form? Even today, their ideas, symbols, and secrets echo through the rituals of the world's most discreet societies, especially within Freemasonry. This is a true story. A story that connects holy wars, international banking, secret rituals, and symbols hidden in plain sight. Today, we're going to uncover who the Knights Templar really were, and why, even centuries after their fall, they remain the cornerstone of everything we now call a secret society. In the year 1054, the church was torn in two. On one side, Rome, on the other, Constantinople. The Roman Catholic Church officially split from the Eastern Orthodox Church, and a conflict was born that would stretch across centuries. But this division wasn't just theological, it was deeply political. On one side stood the Pope, on the other, emperors. Both wanted to rebuild the Christian empire, but each with different visions and different leaders. Rome knew that if it wanted to lead the Christian world, it needed something it had never possessed, its own military power. Until then, the Vatican had relied on the armies of kings, making alliances, trading favors, submitting to others' interests. It was a spiritual force, trapped within a political body. That's when a new plan emerged, a quiet plan, born in the shadows of the Vatican. Behind closed doors, a group of cardinals formed a secret faction, united under a single goal: to restore the Roman Empire, only this time with the Pope as emperor. There was just one problem: they didn't have an army. And this is where the story of the Templars truly begins, not as a legend, not as a myth, but as a strategy. In the year 1118, 9 knights took a sacred vow, a vow of poverty, chastity, and loyalty to the church. Led by Hugues de Payens, they established their base in Jerusalem, on a site of deep spiritual significance, the Temple Mount. It was believed that this was once the location of the legendary Temple of Solomon, and from that belief came their name, the Knights Templar. At first, the church paid them little attention. They were few in number, had no wealth, no royal backing. For years, they lived in obscurity, until one man changed everything: Bernard of Clairvaux, a powerful theologian, a strategic thinker, and, crucially, a member of the very secret faction that had created them. He saw beyond the humble appearance of these warrior monks, and in 1128 at the Council of Troy, he succeeded in getting the order officially recognized by the church. That day, the Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ was born, the elite military force of Christian faith. But their role went far beyond protecting pilgrims. They were the embryo of an empire, a disciplined army, devoted and expertly trained in the art of war, prepared to fight the enemies of the church, both seen and unseen. They wore white robes with red crosses, carried swords, but they answered not to kings but to God, or rather to those who claimed to speak in his name. And so, quietly, the church ceased to be merely a throne of gold and incense, and became a throne of steel and blood. With the official recognition of the Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ, the plan was finally in motion. But no one, not even the cardinals who created them, could have predicted just how far these men would go. Their public mission remained the same: to protect Christian pilgrims. But behind the stone walls of their fortresses, something far greater was unfolding. The Templars became an invisible force that moved the world. They created a highly efficient communication network, complete with secure routes, secret codes, hand signals, and gestures. They maintained interconnected fortresses across the continent, with their own logistics and a rigid hierarchy. They trained soldiers, but also diplomats. They received pilgrims, but also managed trade routes. They farmed, cultivated, managed lands, and collected taxes. In practice, they were the medieval equivalent of a multinational corporation, A fusion of army, monastery, bank, embassy, and intelligence agency, all within a single structure. And the more they grew, the more indispensable they became. Then came their boldest move yet. To protect pilgrims from robberies along the road, the Templars created a system of deposits and withdrawals that stretched across regions, a precursor to modern banking. A pilgrim could deposit gold in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem. A simple letter of credit was enough. Security, mobility, and discretion, and of course a fee for the service. But this system soon expanded beyond pilgrims. Kings, nobles, and even clergymen began using the Templars as personal bankers, including the King of France, who would later become one of their fiercest enemies. The order now had economic power, but also political influence. They shaped royal decisions, interfered in treaties, mediated conflicts, and above all, they had complete autonomy. They answered only to the Pope, and even then, often acted without his permission. But more dangerous than their weapons or their wealth was something else entirely: knowledge. During the Crusades, the Templars came into direct contact with Jewish communities, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and even Muslims. They exchanged knowledge, explored ancient ruins, and studied forgotten scriptures. They uncovered non-canonical gospels, documents that challenged the official version of Christianity, and truths so profound they could shake the very foundation of the Church. And at that moment, the narrative began to shift. The order that had once been seen as defenders of the faith was now perceived as a threat to it. Outwardly, they still wore their white mantles marked with red crosses, but within, they had become guardians of secrets the Vatican dared not speak aloud. And so, a question began to haunt the corridors of the Church. Were they still soldiers of God, or had they become holders of a power God would never have allowed? The Church chose to answer that question with fire. But first, they needed a reason to justify the purge. And so a wave of accusations began to spread. Heresy, obscure rituals, idol worship, denial of Christ, no proof, just rumors, but all with one goal: to destroy the Templars' image before destroying them completely. And that dark moment is closer than it seems. Everything was in place. The public image of the Templars had been carefully dismantled through strategically planted accusations. But the true reason behind the persecution was never about altars. It was about vaults. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, owed the Templars a colossal fortune, loans that had funded wars, ambitious projects, and the luxury of his royal court. But the debt was unpayable, and even worse, humiliating. France, one of the most powerful nations in Europe, was now at the mercy of a religious order. Philip knew he would never be able to repay it, but he also knew that if the Templars ceased to exist, the debt would vanish with them. It was a political move, an economic play, and a strategic strike. But he couldn't do it alone, so the Crown and the Church drew closer. The Church, shrewd and calculating, presented fabricated evidence of heresy. They claimed the order had strayed from the faith, that it practiced blasphemous rituals, that it had built an empire within an empire. The king, who only needed a pretext, gave the green light for extermination. And so the alliance between throne and altar was sealed. In the early morning hours of Friday, October 13th, 1307, the arrests began. Thousands of members were captured across France in a single day. It was a coordinated, calculated assault. Few managed to escape. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, was among those taken. He was tortured for years. He refused to reveal the Order's secrets. He refused to confess to crimes he did not commit. In 1314, he was burned at the stake in Paris. Other Templar leaders were executed alongside him. And with that, the Order of the Knights Templar was officially dissolved, but only on paper. Because some did escape, and they didn't flee with gold. They fled with knowledge. Wisdom gathered during the Crusades, ancient writings uncovered in forgotten ruins, apocryphal gospels, lost manuscripts, accounts that contradicted the Church's official narrative. They knew they couldn't preserve this knowledge in libraries. It had to be hidden in plain sight, protected in a new form. And so, some of the survivors journeyed to Scotland. At the time, Scotland was enjoying a period of greater religious autonomy. Church influence there was far more limited. There, the Templars found an unexpected refuge, the stone mason guilds. These trade guilds already had their own rituals, codes, and systems of learning. The Templars, in turn, brought with them discipline, structure, and a treasure trove of knowledge that needed a new body to survive. It wasn't an instant fusion, but it was inevitable. Over time, symbols began to circulate, passphrases, handshakes, signs. The Masons began carrying more than just tools. They now carried ideas. Ideas that had survived persecution. Ideas that little by little began to take on new form. The temple had been destroyed, but a seed had been planted. And while many believed the story had ended there, the truth is, something was only just beginning. Because in time, these ideas, silent, structured, preserved, would rise again. And this time they wouldn't just shape secret orders, but values and institutions that would endure for centuries. The union between the Templars and the Masons was more than a pact for survival. It marked the birth of a silent culture, one that would span centuries, hidden in plain sight. Those who became part of this new brotherhood quickly realized that preserving knowledge wasn't enough. They had to live the values that knowledge represented, and so the focus shifted. The battlefield was no longer geographic, it became internal. The war was now against ignorance, vanity, and impulsiveness within each man. The ideals carried over from the ancient order took on a new, practical shape. The importance of silence when faced with what we do not yet understand. The patience to build one's own awareness, brick by brick. The humility to accept that the world doesn't revolve around our personal truths. The courage to act with integrity, even without recognition. It was no longer about winning battles with swords, but about overcoming personal flaws through discipline. And above all, it was about becoming a builder, not just someone who criticizes from the sidelines. This quiet philosophy began to reshape behavior. Where there had been pride, came sobriety. Where there had been haste, came method. Where there had been dogma, came inquiry. And all of it happened without fanfare. No pulpits, no spectacle. The transformation was nearly invisible, like a stone being polished from the inside out. And maybe that's the most curious part. This new kind of construction didn't demand blind faith. It asked only for the willingness to grow, day by day, through small actions, through consistent choices. And what's most remarkable is that many of these patterns, created long ago by men who wore crosses on their chests and scars on their bodies, survived. Even if you've never heard of them, even if you don't recognize their symbols, they're still here, in the background, in the structures, in the habits, in the way certain institutions operate, in the way some rituals are still performed, in the way certain values continue to be passed down, even in a world that grows more chaotic, shallow, and rushed by the day. But perhaps the most surprising part is what's still to come. Because the legacy of the Templars wasn't left only in ideas. They left concrete marks on the world we live in today, things we use, repeat, and celebrate, without ever realizing where they came from. And some of these things, to this day, remain shrouded in mystery. Legends, symbols, dates, names, stories that travel through time like shadows of a past that refuses to be forgotten. And that is what we're going to explore next. It's astonishing to realize how much of what the Knights Templar created still surrounds us today. Many of the mechanisms that keep our institutions running carry, in some form, Templar DNA. The banking system, for instance, has already been mentioned, but that's just the surface. What most people don't notice is that the very way we think about organizational structure, codes of conduct, and command systems also bears their mark. The Templars were pioneers in creating a functional, replicable model of operation. They established clearly defined roles, created strict codes of conduct, internal punishments, initiation rituals, communication protocols. They had leadership, sub-leadership, and decentralization, all operating with total cohesion. It was the efficiency of a modern corporation in the 12th century. This model would go on to influence religious orders, military institutions, businesses, and later Freemasonry itself, which absorbed much of that structure, transforming stone and sword into concept and symbol. Another, even quieter legacy lies in recognition systems and internal communication methods. Handshakes, signals, passphrases. These elements, still used today in discrete societies around the world, can be directly traced back to Templar methods. They were born out of necessity to protect and identify allies in times of danger, and evolved into a way of maintaining an invisible bond among those who shared the same values. But the Templar legacy doesn't end with systems. It also lives on in the legends that still echo through our culture, like the infamous Friday the 13th. The superstition originates from the exact day the Templars were betrayed, Friday, October 13th, 1307. The day marked the beginning of their coordinated persecution across France. From that point forward, the number and the day became associated with bad luck, downfall, and conspiracy. Or consider the goat, a symbol so deeply misunderstood. During interrogations and torture, Templars refused to reveal the order's secrets. In France, a saying emerged, "They speak as much as a goat," meaning they said nothing. The goat became a symbol of silence and loyalty. Later, those who failed to understand the depth of the symbol would misinterpret and demonize it. And then there's the legend of the Holy Grail, the chalice said to have been used by Christ at the Last Supper. It became associated with the Templars because no one could explain the extent of their influence, wealth, and strategic brilliance. How do you explain the extraordinary when your mind is limited by the ordinary? You invent a legend. And that's exactly what happened. The more remarkable the Templars became, the more myths arose around them. Myths that, no matter how distorted, still carried a grain of truth. The sense that there was something greater behind the order, something that couldn't be fully understood through the lens of common thought. And perhaps that is the greatest proof that the world never forgot them, because the things we cannot fully comprehend, we choose to eternalize. The Templars vanished from history, but they reappeared in the orders that followed. Freemasonry inherited their rituals, symbols, hierarchical structure, and the ideal of inner construction. The Order of Malta preserved their connection to Catholicism and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. The Rosicrucians absorbed the esoteric, occult, and alchemical dimensions. And societies like Skull and Bones in the United States carried this legacy straight into the heart of modern politics. Different names, same backbone. What was once cross and sword became structure and rhetoric. What was once a vow of poverty became selectivity. What was once silence became influence. None of this is inherently good or bad. It's simply the continuation of a logic, a way to build influence out of sight, using symbols, loyalty, and strategy. These organizations understood what the Templars had already mastered. True power doesn't announce itself, it endures. And that's why, even today, we see echoes of their model in modern institutions. The hierarchy of military forces, the internal structure of political parties, the coded language used in international councils, the symmetry of grand cathedrals and government buildings, the symbols found on money, flags, and monuments. Often, we think these things are just coincidences, but repetition reveals pattern, and pattern reveals origin. What's most intriguing is that these marks survive without explanation because they were designed to. They are still passed down today, subtly, selectively, discreetly. Most people will never notice, but those who begin to see the signs rarely look at the world the same way again. And perhaps that is the true Templar presence in the modern age, not as a secret organization, but as a language embedded in the world, discreet, functional, timeless, and still very much alive. Not in the name of a cross, but in the name of an idea that never needed a name to keep existing.